Okay, welcome to the Praxis Behind the Obscure podcast. And today I have a special guest all the way from, are you in New York? Where are you located?
I'm in New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Okay. So
Yeah.
we're both on the opposite ends of the world. I'm just waking up. He's winding down. So um, yeah. So yeah, I'm kind of curious. You're Matt from Spirit Fire Tarot, and I came across you actually through Prior RC's podcast. I thought that was a really good podcast that you did together, and so thought it'd be kind of cool to bring you on here and have you talk about your tarot practices. So yeah, maybe for the listeners, if you can kind of introduce yourself, a little bit about your background and how you got into the tarot and esoteric practices in general.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Well, first off, thank you for having me and inviting me on the show.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I I'm a relative. I'm not somebody who's been into tarot for my whole life. But I've
Mhm.
always been a very spiritual person in various formats, in various ways. And I had a very kind of more like I guess you'd call it conservative Christian religious upbringing.
Mhm.
And without going into too many of the details, that as it sometimes does, kind of flamed out in my mid-20s.
Your whole biography.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There'll be
Right,
at least a couple of people who've heard that story before, in some form or
right.
another, right?
Right.
So so you don't the details vary from place to place, but people recognize that one. That's an archetype.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so after that, I kind of was sort of adrift, and but always had this sort of like interest in well, in spirituality in general, but also just in always been interested in, I guess you would say, small e esotericism, just things that wasn't what everybody else was interested in.
Mhm.
Um, and from that kind of like predilection, that sort of like general way of looking at things, I just kind of started falling down these progressively weirder and weirder rabbit holes, looking into things like just in philosophy and and religion and all of this. And somehow the book Meditations on the Tarot
Mhm.
came across my interest screen, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll check that out. And I've read a lot of strange and interesting things before, but
Mhm.
never quite something like that. That just sort of blew my socks off in a way that I just really wasn't expecting.
Okay.
And
That's interesting. I've never read that book. So what is it? I mean, it's meditations on the tarot. So is it sort of like is it sort of guided meditations on each of the cards, or how is it kind of laid out?
no, it's a really strangely structured book, and it's not the kind of thing that somebody who wants to learn how to read tarot should check out right away. you know
Okay.
yeah, it just happened to work out that way for me. But so what it is, there was an occultist who he wrote the book anonymously. So I'll sort of start there.
Mm,
He wrote the book anonymously and didn't want it published until after he died.
mm,
Since that time, which I think the original publication was like in the mid 70s, it was translated into English in like 1980 or so.
mhm,
Um, since that time, it's pretty well been discovered that who it was Valentin Tomberg,
mm,
who he had primarily been associated with Rudolf Steiner and the Anthroposophy movement,
mm.
um, but ended up kind of breaking with that, going his own way, and then becoming a staunch convert to Roman Catholicism.
Oh, very interesting.
Right, which is kind of a weird journey. He was born in Russia, and he had been a bunch of different things, including an
Wow.
anthroposophist, pretty high level one, and
Mm,
then became a convert to Roman Catholicism.
mm,
So, in his meditations on the tarot, which were published after his death, he basically summed up, I guess the way you would call it, is like his lifetime of spiritual reflection, um, in the format of letters to an unknown friend. It's the person reading it. And each letter is tied to one of the major arcana of the tarot.
Oh, wow. That sounds really interesting. I'll have to check it out. I've heard about it several times before, but never really cracked into it. So it sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that if you're not ready for it, it's just like totally undo you, you know? In a good way, But
okay.
yeah, but so from there, I became more interested in tarot generally. You know, because the book is really not about divination or you know, having a practice with the tarot. It's just more of these explorations of how the tarot unlocks all of this. So I got fascinated with that, and you know, I started stumbling around a little bit more. I think there was a conversation with a friend of mine about the movie Hodorowski's Dune, you know, the documentary, and he had mentioned to me Hodorowski's history with the tarot because we've been talking about it a little bit. I thought, oh, okay, I'll check that out. So you know, I ended up getting the deck that he had, the Marseille deck, and all these things kind of happened from there. It was a few years ago. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Was there something specific, like when you first saw the cards, or like, so like I remember the first time I saw tarot cards, it was, I think I was in elementary school actually, and one of my mom's friend was into like astrology and tarot and stuff like that. And they were doing like a tarot reading. I think it was the Celtic spread or something like that, right? And I remember like the first time, I don't remember what deck it was. I was so young back then. I think it was the Rider-Waite deck, probably, which is the most common one, right? Yeah. So I remember just looking at the, you know, the images and the symbols and being kind of enthralled, or sort of like, wow, this is interesting. What's this all about, you know? And never really got around to looking into it until much later, probably like 20 years later, 15 years later. But I know I had a pretty, I don't know what you would say, just an interesting reaction upon seeing the cards. They sort of, you know, the archetype sort of hit you on for me, hit me on like a primal level or something. But how about for you? Like, what was was it that book that you mentioned? Was it Meditations on the Tarot that first sort of really captured your attention and got you into this?
That was probably the first thing that really captured my attention. But I remember seeing, kind of like you said, like I remember seeing these images or encountering them here and there. As a kid, there's a memory that's coming into my head of like watching TV late at night and seeing one of those ads for, you know, psychic readings or something, and seeing these like tarot cards on the like one and just being like, what is that, you know? And I'd see them here and there, but partially because of my background, there was always this kind of like, there was on the one hand this allure, but then also this fear. So which kind of made it exciting, but I also didn't want to look at it too closely, you know.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of my friends that aren't into esoteric stuff or occultism, they might look at tarot cards and be like, "Oh, that's a cheap scam," or, you know, like you're saying, like like an infomercial, psychic,
right,
psychics.com or something. But what's funny on the other end though, these same people, they'll be like super into like Joseph Peterson talking about mythology and symbolism, and like and like, you know, Joseph Campbell. I'm like, well, do you kind of like, that's what these cards are? It's literally, you know, the same sort of symbolism and sort of hero's journey and things along these lines, right? But I definitely do think tarot to a degree. I think it's sort of because of those what would you say? I don't even know the term for it, like infomercial psychics or something.
Right.
Yeah, I know there's probably a term for it, but it's probably because of those people. A lot of people sort of, maybe they're turned off by even looking into tarot cards, might see it as some sort of weird cheap, like a cheap trick, or it's a cheap scam to make money or something, things along these lines, right?
Yeah, well, you know, it's kind of interesting. I had that feeling when you know, because I kept this more or less to myself for quite a while in my practice, you know, and before I was like, all right, I'm going to start doing this for other people besides my like super inner circle. And that was the reaction, like, oh, you're into this, you know, like, well, you're a pretty rational, level-headed sort of person, like maybe and I'm like, you know, so but people definitely have that color from somewhere, you know, whether it's those infomercials or just old movies and, you know, the fortune teller, in the werewolf movie kind of thing. That's what I always think of. That really colors people's perceptions of it.
Yeah, very true, very true. Okay, what you did mention actually earlier that you work with the Marseille deck, is that right?
Yeah, primarily I work with Marseille decks. Yeah.
Okay, I'm curious, like, why that deck in particular, and also, have you worked with other decks, and have you noticed, like, for example, I have 3 tarot decks. I have one called the Golden Dawn Magical Tarot, and then I have
Mhm.
the Rider Waite, which is, I still think it's the most common one, at least that I've seen around, right? The Rider Waite.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's pretty fair to say.
Yeah, and I recently got this deck in the mail. I think it was yesterday, actually, or maybe 2 days ago. It's
Oh, this is the one you sent me the picture of, right? Is that
yeah,
the?
yeah. I've wanted to
Okay.
get this a while, actually. I guess they just recently started reprinting it or remanufacturing it. It's Lon Milo Duquette's Tarot of Ceremonial Magic, which is really cool.
Yes.
It's really cool. It's sort of like a much different than other tarot decks that I have or seen, because it's sort of like a file cabinet for a bunch of different occult systems. Like you have the Enochian on there, like little Enochian
Hmm.
tablets, and then you have like astrological correspondences. You have the Goetia. It's like literally all of like, it's
Right.
like literally with these cards. It's pretty interesting with these cards. Like you can study pretty much every occult system or even use them sort of in a ritual setting. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, it's quite interesting. It's definitely a different type of tarot. But yeah, I'm curious, have you noticed any differences working with maybe the Marseille or versus another deck, or was there something particular that drew you to the Marseille deck?
Well, so I think the first thing was that was the imagery that I had seen in Meditations of the Tarot. So that was kind of like I wanted to see what that was all about, and that's
Hmm.
why I kind of like hunted that out first.
Hmm.
Um, from there, you know, I got more interested in history of it and all that sort of thing, and the oldness of it was really appealing. The kind of primitive nature of it.
Mm.
Um, and I think there's something, especially like later as I started playing around with other decks and learning other things.
Hmm.
One thing that I like about the Marseille deck as opposed to the Rider Waite and other, you know, because even the Rider Waite, there's all these other decks that are like more broadly in the Rider Waite system, you know, like
Uh-huh.
you can go and find these like Angel and Fairy, whatever. You can find a million different types of decks that are
Mm-hmm.
based on that Rider Waite system. Um, and it's really I think it's beautiful. It's popular for a reason. But there's something about the pip decks that don't have the illustrated minors. You know, where
Mm.
there's not a character on the number cards. Um,
Mm.
that allows a different kind of flexibility and a different kind of it allows you to access a different aspect of the intuition I find when working with it.
Okay.
Yeah, and so actually, there's another deck that I've been using a lot personally. So like if I'm working with a client, I'm almost always using a Marseille deck. But the deck that I've been using myself, kind of like for my own work lately, is kind of a weird hybrid. It's the Knapp Hall Tarot that Manly P. Hall did.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I haven't heard of. I know Manly P. Hall, but I haven't heard of that deck in specific.
Yeah, it's also I think it's called the Revised New Art Tarot.
Hmm.
Um, it's the other name for it, but the same what's his name? Uh, Arthur Knapp, the guy who painted all the illustrations in Manly Hall's famous book, worked on this tarot with him, and it's a really interesting hybrid because it is definitely uses like the Marseille imagery and it has French names under all the majors.
Hmm.
But there's also kind of like what you were talking about with Lon Milo Duquette's tarot. There's also all this esoteric stuff in the that's kind of like put into it. So there's astrological things, there's Hebrew letters and correspondences for Kabbalism and different fields of numerology and all this different stuff. There's a lot of alchemical imagery and symbols that are annotated and put into the cards. And yeah, I really like it. And kind of to your question, I do think that there are different energies that you feel from different decks, and you know, like this one, the Nap Hall one is more. I mean, I use it for doing readings with it and stuff for myself, but it's more contemplative and more like kind of puts you into different spaces and correspondences. But I also find that it does not pull any punches when you ask it a question at all. Whereas, you know, a lot of times I'll find with the Marseille deck, it'll be like, it's a little more tough lovey if I need to hear something that I don't necessarily want to. It's like, well, you know, you might want to think about this. Whereas the Nap Hall is just like, bro, get your shit together.
That's interesting. Yeah, each deck sort of has its own vibe or energy, and I mean even the images are quite different, right? So yeah, that is quite interesting. Okay, so I'm curious, how do you personally use tarot in practice? Like, you know, there's different, like, are you mostly using it with clients or on yourself or both, or what sort of I'm kind of interested in how you use them, and then what kind of influence your approach to how you practice with the tarot.
Sure. So I guess I would say that you know, I tend to think there's kind of like two broad schools of looking at it, that, you know, one is more psychological and one is more like predictive. And I would say that I generally fall way more into the psychological camp. And I'm looking with whether, so there's so if I'll back up a little bit. I'm working with myself. I have a basically like a daily practice of just pulling 3 cards pretty much every day and just sort of thinking about what those energies mean. And they are definitely tied to events sometimes, and there may be a predictive or you know, a predictive aspect of it, but that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. I often find it sort of happens accidentally. Like at the end of the day, I'll be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's what happened. That's what that meant." But I'm really trying to like, it's more like a tool for me to frame my thoughts and my experiences around. And also, there's an element of using it as a sort of mirror or a check of other things that I'm doing. So in my meditative practice, where, you know, I'll have certain thoughts that will come up that I'll want to explore or go to, and I get these ideas. I find that the two kind of like play into each other really well, and keep me, I don't know what the word is for it, I guess grounded, or it helps balance. The two practices sort of help balance each other, so that I weigh into it that way. And then yeah, and then I'll do certain, you know, if there's a particular issue or a problem that I want to kind of dig into a little bit, I'll do a little bit more. I'll kind of treat myself as the client, and I'll give myself a little consultation, and sort of see what comes up from that, and that's pretty helpful. But that's not like an everyday occurrence. That's
right. So in that context, you use like a full spread. So you're talking about how you would draw like a random card and sort of meditate on it, right?
Yeah.
In the other context that you're talking about, the latter, would you do like a full, I don't know, there's so many, that's one thing about the tarot that's also interesting. Not only are there a lot of decks out there, but there are so many different spreads. There's like a 3-card spread, a 5-card spread, a Celtic cross, a 15-card spread, right? Like what?
Yeah, and there are multiple types of 3-card and 5-card, and yeah, all those.
Exactly. So is there any, are there any like spreads in particular that you work with?
Yeah, there's a few. Well, you know, actually, I like a good old fashioned Celtic cross sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, it's got a lot of, I guess what I would say is it has a strong egregore built up around it, you know?
Yeah,
People
I
have been
agree.
doing it.
That's actually the one that I use. So all the way out
Yeah.
here in Korea. So,
Hmm.
so contributing to that egregore, huh?
Right. Exactly. Right. So you're kind of tapping into that.
Mhm.
And then there's a spread I really love. I use it all the time, both for myself and for other people.
Mhm.
That is called the Rose Spread, and I got that from a guy named Weston who has a podcast called Rootlock Radio.
Mhm.
And it's basically a 5 card spread that's in the shape of a rose, but you do this really wonderful process of digging into a problem, seeing it from the root, and seeing all the different things that you have to navigate to get to the blossom of the desired outcome that you want. And I find that's a really nice framework to, especially when somebody's dealing with a more specific um, issue that they want some insight into. It really kind of helps unlock some stuff for people. That's another part of it. I think for me is like, you know, I'm not I don't just throw down cards generally and say like this means this. I try to look at it as very like collaborative and interactive experience. I want to see what imagery is evoked with, you know, like what those things, what feelings come up for the person who's seeing it. I might tell them some, you know, association or some meaning, but then I want to get their feedback and we kind of like collaborate. So it's so they're kind of invested in it. And that spread is really great for that, I found. So that's one of my favorites.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't heard of that one. What'd you say? The name was the Rose. What was
The
the name of that?
Rose.
The Rose.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Can people? Is that like available online, or is it printed, or is that like a specific, like one that?
Yeah. You can yeah, you can find it on Weston at Rootlock Radio is I think his Instagram. I think he's got the spread up there. Basically, I can describe it really quickly if you want.
Oh,
It's
sure. Okay.
yeah, so you lay out the cards kind of in the shape of a rose. The bottom one is going to be the root. To the side of it, which I usually do on the right side, is going to be the thorn.
Hmm.
And you can kind of think of that as sort of like the cross card in a Celtic cross.
Hmm.
Um, then the next card up is going to be directly on top of the root card. That's going to be the stem. The next card is called the bud, and the final card, and that's on the opposite end of the thorn. And
Hmm.
the card at the top um, is the blossom. So you kind of like
Mm.
have the structure to navigate, almost like a little narrative as you
Oh,
go
cool.
through it. Yeah.
That sounds pretty neat. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so your style, you mentioned to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier, you mentioned you have sort of a psychological approach. You approach each card as sort of like a like an archetype or a psychological mirror, right? Like it's
Mm.
revealing certain maybe aspects of yourself or your life or your decisions and whatnot, right? To yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's pretty fair. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you have some really really cool posts on Instagram. I hope people follow you. Your Instagram is Spear of Fire Tarot, is that right?
That's right.
Your
Yes.
ID? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I remember after listening to the podcast with Friday RC, I think I pulled up your Instagram, and like the first one I saw, I think it was this one. It was the Judgment, right?
Mm.
Um and oh, do you mind if I read this real quick? Is it okay?
Yeah, go ahead. No, that's fine.
Okay, because I read this, I was like, man, this is great. Because that's when I also use tarot. Like every now and then, I don't work a lot with it, but every now and then I'll draw a tarot card and sort of maybe do like a path working or a meditation on it, right? And
Hmm.
sort of scrying the tarot and seeing what sort of images or teachings or yeah, what it's kind of reflecting to myself, right? And so that's what
Mm.
when I read this, it sort of reminds me of my own experiences, um, or sort of the what would you say the sort of headspace I put myself in when I draw a card
Mm.
too. So I thought it was
Yes.
really cool and insightful the way that you wrote it down, because I don't think I'm as gifted with words as maybe you are, but yeah, it's all going on. The energy and the teachings are happening to me, but it's just harder to put into words, I would say, for me. But yeah, you write here, the Judgment has been my stalker card lately. The human psyche, or soul, is structured by, through, and within narratives and story. You'll often hear it said that our thoughts become our reality. To me, this isn't simply a New Age platitude, but hints at the deep truth that all of our perceptions and experiences are scaffolded upon the kinds of stories that inhabit our psyches. Those perceptions and experiences are what our reality consists of. We can construct fantasies of our own unworthiness or futility. We can construct delusions of grandeur. Or we can, as Aidan Watcher puts it, spend the effort to get clear about what is and isn't our actual state. Our native state before our minds became colonized by the stories, ideals, limitations, and expectations of others. I think the judgment is calling me to wake up into a story that's different from the ones I've been telling myself or have had dictated to me. What story are you telling yourself? Is it still serving your highest good? So I thought that was really good. It's sort of, it sounds like you use the card to sort of step away from maybe all these narratives that you're telling yourself and social conditioning and social media and the news and, all these sort of programs, I guess you would say, that are out there in the ether, and kind of step away from it all and kind of reflect on, is this even, beneficial to me? Is this even what, is this the sort of paradigm I want to take on, right? So,
right. Yeah,
that's really, really awesome.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you for the kind words. Yeah.
I hope people find you on. I'll put this in the show notes too, right? I'll include a link to your Instagram, and I think you have a Facebook page too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Definitely.
The Facebook algorithm is a little weird, so I don't know how many people are finding me on that, but yeah, I definitely am on both places. So
you're about to get blocked as hate speech. Teaching people about themselves and their psyche. Hey, that's hateful. We're going to censor that.
Well, we're laughing, but there's actually something kind of, I wonder how far we are from that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I heard Matt bought shares of what's that? GameStop. He's evil. He's a part of this hateful bigotry movement.
Exactly. Yeah. He's a black guy who's a white supremacist,
Yeah, typical. That's hilarious.
Yeah. So, well, I think there is actually kind of something dangerous about, waking people up to their own agency in some way. I think that does kind of threaten some powers that be, maybe not all of them, but and so I guess that's actually one of the reasons that I think there are other tools that probably can do this, but tarot is one that I really resonate with, and it seems to work well for me and for others to do that, to kind of step outside of it. I think if it's used, there are ways that you can use it that are really good for breaking up entrenched patterns, or at least letting you pursue different possibilities. And I think that's just really huge for people, especially right now. I think we all really need that to sort of like take, I don't necessarily want to say control, because it's not like we have control over every single aspect of our reality, but I think we have a lot more control than we realize, and we also are served best by leaning into the amount of control that we have and putting our efforts and our attention there, if that makes sense.
Oh, for sure. I think that especially in the modern age with social media and people sort of, like you said in your post with the judgment card, it's sort of like the way I look at it is like a lot of people, they're just sort of running these scripts of, I don't know where they're coming from. Maybe it's almost like people are spitting out algorithms of algorithms or something. It's like, we hate Trump, so then it's like everything I'm going to post and think about and talk about is going to be about Trump. And it's sort of, they never really looked inside of themselves and they never really looked themselves in the mirror. It's just more about, spitting out whatever narratives are fed to them, and whatever, whatever's the trendy thing to hate today, or to like today, or to talk about today, right? Whereas
Right.
they never really stepped outside of these narratives, or these sort of conditioned ideologies or whatnot, and kind of took the time to put themselves in a vulnerable state, and maybe not scapegoat everything, but to look at themselves in a different light, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's kind of weird because I guess, this is no surprise to people who are into like hermeticism and stuff like that, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the microcosm and the macrocosm match up here, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
things that are sort of affecting us society wide, I think are affecting a lot of us at a very individual level.
Oh,
Um,
for sure, for sure.
and the more of us can kind of like turn on a little bit, the
Mm-hmm.
more we can kind of help alleviate some of the misery and frustration and meaninglessness and all that crap in our own lives.
Mm-hmm.
The more of us who can kind of do that, I think the better it gets for everybody. You know.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. Especially, yeah, it just seems like communication is such a rare commodity these days, right? Like having a talk where you can actually listen to the other person and sort of try to think from their perspective, or take on their um, maybe their mindset or reality tunnel, rather than "you're wrong, fuck you, no."
Right.
This sort
Right.
of I don't know what you would call it, like a childish, immature form of it. Maybe it's due to social media or whatnot, but yeah, just
Well,
taking the chance. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah. No, I was just as you said that, I think I don't know that it's really due to social media, but I think
Mhm.
social media just amplifies something that's already been there. Like I don't know. Are you familiar with Rene Girard at all? The
No.
French thinker. Yeah,
Mm-mm.
he was this French thinker who had this whole theory, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing because it goes everywhere, but
Mhm.
had this whole theory that there was this, he called it mimetic desire, and mimetic rivalry was like the engine that kind of drove all human society. And
Mhm.
it's basically that ability we have to mimic each other and want the same things that somebody else wants. So you want the car that somebody else has, or everybody wants a mate, but the kind of mate that you want the hot girl who is whatever your culture defines a hot girl at that particular time.
Mhm.
And everything is hunky-dory until whatever the thing is that a person desires becomes a scarce resource.
Mm.
Everyone starts kind of like fighting over it,
Mhm.
and the whole like society starts to kind of unravel until somebody, like, we all sort of decide that there's a scapegoat. It's that
Mhm.
person's fault and we sacrifice them, right? So according to Girard, that process happened in every little village, every little place uh, all over the earth in our early, prehistory. And like once that process gets rolling, it's what kind of drives all of culture and religion and the sacrificed gods, archetype and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
And the thing that's kind of, I think, fascinating about it, because Gerard died, I think, in 2010,
Mm.
and social media wasn't what it was now, but like Facebook was just kind of starting, and um, like it was starting to get to be a thing. And I remember listening to this interview with him, and he was just like, "Boy, this is gonna get," like they're just like throwing a can of gasoline on this thing.
Mhm.
And one the other like interesting thing and how this ties into social media was one of his grad students was actually Peter Thiel
Oh,
from
wow.
PayPal. And
Wow.
part of the reason that Peter Thiel invested so heavily in Facebook was because of his background as a Girardian. He said, "Oh, this thing is going to be like crack." you know, nobody,
Yeah.
everyone wants to see what everybody else is up to and what they're doing and what they're thinking. And
Mhm.
we have this great, it's kind of like there's that joke like every day there's one person who's the star of Twitter, and the object is to never be that person, right?
That's funny. That is
That's that
hilarious.
that's that scapegoat, right?
Mm.
In action.
Yeah, that's quite hilarious. Yeah. Yeah, I have to look in. What's the name of the writer that you mentioned?
Rene Girard, Girard.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that. Yeah, definitely. I don't think social media is necessarily the cause of it, but it's sort of like you said. It's sort of exaggerated it, or sort of played on certain psychological tendencies, as you've said, right? And
Hmm.
I like that post, that your Instagram post, because it gives you sort of like, you're familiar with Robert Anton Wilson, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He has this video, this little short, I think it's like a 3-minute clip on YouTube, where he's saying how culture is not your friend, and how all these sort of it's like, culture is not your friend. Usually you hear the opposite, right? Like, I'm trying to get
Right.
cultured, or I'm in the culture. But he's saying basically, like, all of these things in culture are like brainwashing you and getting you on their agenda, right? It's like
Right.
Facebook is getting you on Facebook's algorithm agenda, and the news is getting you on the whatever, right? Like fear
Yeah.
agenda, and then the infomercials are getting you on the, buy this product, 3 easy payments of 19.99, that agenda, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, and so yeah, I think that, I mean, I think the tarot, it's a nice organic way, to sort of step back from that and find your own agenda, find your own path, find your own inspiration, right? Find your own
Yes. Yeah.
inner guidance, rather than looking to the outside,
Well,
outside culture, which has its own agenda in a way, right?
right. Well, and I think what it does, because tarot has its own culture too, right? You can get all
Okay.
the books and like this means this and this means that, and this is how you interpret this card and how you interpret that card. And I actually don't necessarily think that's all bad, right?
Hmm.
Like we have to
Right.
kind of know something, right? You have to
Hmm.
start somewhere. But I think what I think it's very helpful for, what I found it helpful for, is being aware of where you're dipping into culture and who you're aligning with and how conscious you are of your alignment. Like I don't think we should all live in a cabin in the woods and be
Hmm.
um, you know, off the grid. I think if you can do that and that works for you, great. but
Sure.
but
Sure.
but like I'm embedded in a particular culture, or in different layers of cultures, really.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that there's something really powerful about being aware of how much of your presuppositions are just a product of the culture. Um,
Hmm.
and kind of consciously choosing when you are going to say, like, okay, well, in this instance my culture's uh, uh, aims are aligned with mine, so I'll happily go along with it. But on those times where you just are going and playing for your team because that's all you've ever done, and
Hmm.
you've never looked at it in a different way, I think there's some real utility in having a tool that helps kind of like break that up and let you think about consciously what you're trying to do. Like, what are the stories you're telling yourself? Why are you telling yourself those stories? Are those stories taking you to where you want to go? Are you even sure you know what you want? That's not always an easy
Mm.
a thing that people don't always know that they want what they're told they should want. Um,
Exactly. Exactly.
you know,
Sort of a meditative tool to find your own true will, and see if current actions and behaviors, beliefs, and whatnot align with that, and even being aware of what you want and what society is sort of dictating, right? Like, awareness is sort of the first step, right? So that
mm,
you can actually start making conscious decisions, because if you're just not aware and running scripts, blindly,
right.
then you don't really know, you know you're operating on some sort of other agenda. So just being aware of what you're doing is sort of, like, step number one, right? And as you
Yeah.
mentioned, cards give you that. They can at least put you at step number one, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's not like they're gonna, not like they're gonna dictate, act for you in your life, or
Right.
achieve your goals for you, but nonetheless they can at least give you a little bit of a, maybe insight, or a, like a flashlight on the dark trail, or things along those lines, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the hermit's lamp, right? You know,
Yeah.
I think also, as we're discussing this, one thing that occurs to me is that they offer an interesting opportunity not just to think about what's kind of like reflected in your own psyche,
Hmm.
but to interact and have a conversation with other people
Hmm.
who aren't there, you know, like physically with you, like because it's part of a tradition, you know,
Mm.
that where, you know, when you're just kind of interacting with your culture through daily conditioning, you just it's basically like these forces are acting upon you, you know, you know, like your
Yeah,
job
right.
and everything is good. And so other people are a lot of the times sorted into that whole, like they're either obstacles in your way or they're things that you can use to get what you want, right? They're not
Hmm.
really like beings or things with their own agency.
Hmm.
And then somebody will get into like will come into your little bubble and they're very high resolution and you're like, oh, this is an actual person. Maybe they're my friend or my enemy or my, you know, my lover or whatever. But
Hmm.
you know, a lot of what we interact with, it's like we don't sit in our cars with a bunch of other people sitting in their cars. We sit in traffic, right?
Mm. Right.
You know, and that that is a lot of the way in which we converse and we interact with the social world.
Hmm.
Um, and tarot, it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, it is very private and, you know, usually done. A person will do this, you know, meditative kind of thing, like we're talking about, or they'll be one-on-one with somebody else who's giving a reading, or they'll be in a tight circle of small friends. But I think that one thing that's kind of cool about tarot is you're also talking to the people who painted those pictures. You know, if you're using a Rider Waite deck, there's some, you know, Arthur Waite and Pamela Smith are talking to you in some sense, you know,
Mm.
and the people who wrote those were people who drew the images that became the Marseille Tarot and the tarots that were before that. Um, those, you know, that's embedded in a tradition, that's embedded in the experience and the lives of people
Mm.
for centuries, really. Um, and so it is a way to kind of like interact with the social world, um, and learn and leverage that experience and learn what other people have thought without necessarily being acted upon at the same, the same way that so much social experience takes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense. I was just thinking as you were saying that, I was thinking like, you know how the major arcana are sort of like there are all these like specific archetypes, right? That are associated with each of these cards, right? And so I was wondering, like, if you're getting really deep into tarot, I could just imagine like walking outside the door and like you're seeing everybody as like one of the major arcana, right?
Right.
Like you see like, oh, that guy's like some just pissed off guy, you know, he's like yelling at a man and a woman, like, oh, that's the devil or something. And then
Right.
you look over there, you know, like the high priestess is over there. You start seeing these sort of like archetypes projected onto people, right? Like I could totally
Oh
see.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's pretty
Well, it's
interesting.
kind of funny, you know, like even as I was saying that I do a lot of like more psychological work, it's
Hmm.
kind of funny because every now and then you work with somebody and like it's just exactly what it looks like, you know. Like I
Hmm.
remember one time doing a reading and the queen of coins or pentacles if you're using Rider Waite, but
Hmm.
coins in the Marseille deck came up and I was, you know, like talking to the person. I'm like, well, you know, this could represent this blah 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 blah. I'm like, or it could also be a person, and she's like looks at it, she goes, oh no, that's the treasurer I work with at my job. She's a major bitch and she's giving me I'm like, or it's that, you know.
That's
Like
hilarious. That's
that's
hilarious.
that probably is what it is actually, now that we look at it, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's all the angle you take, right? It's
right.
the perspective you have. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's why I think it is important. Like you were saying, when you do, I haven't done that many readings for people. I've done a handful because I have like a real basic understanding. But I'm still able to do like real basic readings for people. But at least when I've done them before, instead of telling them, like you were saying earlier, instead of telling them like, oh, this means this, and like this sort of weird, rigid like approach or whatever. I
Mhm.
also like to, when I turn over the card, it's like I think the first question I remember asking people is like, what do you feel when you see this card, or what emotion does this evoke, or what thought comes to mind, right? So it's sort of
Mm.
getting them involved in it, getting them sort of turning on their intuitive and psychic faculties in themselves, rather than me putting in my own preconceptions or predispositions into their reading, right?
Right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. I had a good friend of mine who I had done like the first tarot reading she'd ever had, and she said afterwards, she goes, I look at these cards and there's this weird kind of, it's interesting, but it's also kind of scary imagery, and
Mhm.
I'm fascinated, but I'm also a little like nervous. And what she appreciated was that she's like, it was like we were taking a walk through a forest that I wouldn't have wanted to walk through by myself. But
Mm.
it was fine that you were there, And then by the
Mhm.
end, it was a nice walk. Whereas it would have been a scary walk in a dark forest if you don't have the right person. So
Mm.
that's kind of what I like to do. It's like if we're gonna churn up all the stuff in the unconscious,
Mhm.
mind that's gonna be a little bit much. I want to sort of provide, and that's kind of how I look at my role, is more like let's kind of like walk through this thing together and
Mhm.
get somewhere that we want to go. Um,
Ah, that's a cool perspective. I like that. I think if you want to scare somebody, use the like Crowley's Thoth tarot, because there's some like haunting.
Right.
Yeah, because it's like
Right.
they're same cards essentially. I mean, they are the same cards. There's just a couple, a couple of like the name changes and correspondent changes and whatnot. But
Right.
you can show them the same whatever death or whatever it is. And some of them are definitely more haunting in appearance, I would say, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Well,
think that's yeah.
even the like happy looking cards in that one are kind of scary, Like the Two of Cups is a little like
Right,
frightening. That
right,
one,
right.
like okay. But
Right. Yeah, I remember the first time I saw those cards. It was sort of like, I don't know. It gave me almost a. I really like them actually, but sort of
mhm.
like a. I don't know what you would say. Sort of like a, when you're not necessarily having a bad trip, but when you sort of see haunting imagery on psychedelics or something like that, it had
Okay.
that
Yeah.
kind of vibe at least, right? And then when you see, like, for example, when I see the Marseille deck, it looks almost more, I don't know if you would say happy, but sort of cartoony, like being on
Right.
mushrooms, where you're feeling very happy and
Yeah.
grateful.
Right.
That was those are just my own personal like response to like
Right.
initially looking at them. Yeah. So
That seems about right.
yeah. Okay. Also, I'm kind of curious, like, to sort of um, expand on the tarot stuff. Do you ever use tarot in like Kabbalistic path workings? Have you ever experimented with that approach, like with the Golden Dawn or like Crowley's system? They often use the cards. They overlay them on the Tree of Life and then sort of use them as tools in like path working or scrying the Tree of Life, right?
So yeah, I have not done that in like a Kabbalistic setting.
Mhm.
Probably the closest thing practice that I've done to this was um, Gareth Knight had a series of exercises wherein you um, kind of go into this imaginal space and then interact with the characters and the figures on the cards,
Mhm.
and talk to them.
Mhm.
Um, and it's less like yeah, so I mean it's not necessarily tied to the like Golden Dawn or the Kabbalistic path working, but there's a lot of overlap there. It's similar work from what I understand, even having not done it.
Mhm.
And it's actually very similar to I had a friend describe this very intense uh, retreat, Buddhist meditative retreat he did under like the direction of one teacher, where for like days and days and days he sat and like interacted with all these different figures and demons and angelic figures of this Buddhist tradition. Um, as like had conversations and interactions with them. So it was kind of a little bit more like that, I would say, to a lesser extent.
Mhm.
Um,
Sort
it
of
was really fascinating, very trippy, very trippy.
Oh
You know,
yeah, yeah. It's sort of a like scrying, sort of like a going like creating a portal with the card and going into it and sort of traveling in the landscapes and talking with the main archetype or the
yeah,
main spirit of the card. And yeah, yeah, I'm familiar with that approach as well. So sort of like
yeah,
some people I think they call it like scrying the tarot, right?
yeah. I think I've heard it called that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that's cool. That's pretty cool. Are there any like current do we talk a lot about the tarot and maybe are there any like current like new things you're experimenting with the tarot or even outside of the tarot, maybe in different practices or esoteric
Well,
pursuits?
yeah. So it's a couple things. I'm working on a couple things with tarot. I guess I shouldn't. They're too. They're too like. They're too sketched out to like really like talk about. I'm kind of trying
Right.
to. There's a spread that I'm sort of like trying to develop. I need to kind of
Oh,
experiment
cool.
with it a little bit. I find that I like to, the way I sort of like to work with this stuff is I will, like try it out with myself a little bit and then I'll like maybe hunt down a friend to give me some feedback and like see whether it works or not. And then I'll sort of like, um, put it out into the broader world after I've had a little bit of a chance. So there's something that's kind of in the works there. Just a little 6 card spread that I'm working on.
Hmm.
And as far as like other practices, one of the things that's really excited me lately was I think I actually mentioned him in the judgment card post that you mentioned, the work of Aidan Wachter.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and I read a book of his called Weaving Fate.
Okay.
Um, that is basically like there's 3 sort of like interconnected practices of using um, like a narrative hyper sigil to
Hmm.
um, to move away from what you don't want and move towards more towards what you do want.
Hmm.
And it's that's been really fascinating to kind of, I'm sort of like dipping my toes into that
That sounds
practice and see
interesting.
what that
Hmm.
goes. Yeah, he's a very insightful person, even from just a purely like, even if you don't believe in any of this stuff, which hopefully people listening to this are not in that category, but
Right, right, right. Yeah.
but
Well,
even if you don't,
they're already tuning into an occult podcast. I'm sure they're
right? Yeah, we don't have to like win them over to it, but
yeah, they're probably not too shocked. You know, it's
right,
again, it's kind of hard to shock a cult from
right.
the occult, you know. But
But
yeah, I've heard of him before. I think actually I have listened to a podcast where he was on the Glitch Bottle podcast. I think he did one
oh
or
yeah,
two of them. Yeah, and I remember also I think I saw does he have a book called 6 Ways or something like that?
6 Ways. Yeah, I just actually
Uh-huh.
started reading that. That one's older.
Mhm.
That's like the first book. But I've only read a little bit of it.
It looks pretty cool. I saw like a book review of it somewhere, and sound pretty cool. Like different, like how to take on different mindsets and
Mhm.
sort of it almost sounded more like a chaos magic approach, which was pretty
Yeah,
cool.
I think that is kind of what he's more rooted in, which is,
Hmm.
it's kind of interesting because a lot of the stuff that I have done, and I'm by no means an expert in any of this, is more of like the Golden Dawn and
Hmm.
high magic kind of stuff. But
Hmm. Hmm.
there is something that's really kind of, I also sort of admire the chaos magic, and there's also a real sense. There's also a real folk magic, earthy hoodoo kind of vibe to it too that I really dig. So
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. I know like in the Golden Dawn, I don't remember. I mean, I'm not in the Golden Dawn, so I wouldn't know
right.
the grade that they make you do this. But I think maybe it's Portal or something. I can ask Ryder RC.
Yeah.
One of the grade. I'm sure he'll know, right? Yeah,
And
like a
everything else he'll know too,
yeah,
right?
like a pop-up quiz, right? Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, one of the grades they make you design your own tarot deck, right? Like that's a big part of
Mm.
their thing there. And so have you ever considered maybe, not saying like tomorrow or today or anything like that, but maybe somewhere down the line have you ever thought about creating your own deck or drawing up your own cards, or like for me, I think it would be interesting. Maybe someday I think it'd be fun to do, but I'm not necessarily more of a musical person. I'm really terrible at drawing things, but
Hmm.
I think that I have like basic images in my mind for each card, and then almost having like an artist friend help me to sketch them up would be fun. But if you're an artist, I mean, what a perfect like practice, make your own deck. That's like a dream come true if you're an actual artist, right? Or even
Oh
like
yeah,
a
absolutely.
graphic designer, or familiar with those sort of things. But have you considered making your own deck?
Yeah, in kind of the same way that you have. Like
Mhm.
I'm not that great an artist. I used to draw, comic book type stuff when I was a little kid, but I really fell out of practice.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, I think because you get these ideas of how you maybe change things a little bit or your own sort of spin on it, or even if you don't have the idea, like, I wouldn't say that I have an idea about how all 78 cards should be, but the work of
mhm,
working through that is kind of an interesting thing.
mm.
I have a really good friend who's a graphic designer who I've been like hounding her for years to work on a tarot deck with me. And she's
Right,
like, "Man, I got too
right.
much other shit to do, but someday." you know, she's like,
Right.
there's 78 of those cards, right? I'm like, yeah, I know, but you can back them out in an
Hey, there's
hour.
some money. There's some money in it for you. There,
Right,
money
right.
talks. You get 50% off each sale.
That's
50% on each sale. There you
true.
go. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. That'd be a cool
But
thing
yeah,
to.
it would be a really cool exercise, really fascinating, and yeah, and you never know, like maybe it's something that's really going to resonate with somebody.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Actually, I'm here over in Korea, and tarot cards. Actually, what's kind of interesting, I'm here in Korea, and it's more obviously I'm in the East, I'm in Asia, and like Buddhism, like down the street from my house, you have like 1,000-year-old Buddhist temple, and
Mm.
obviously there's more Eastern like Taoism and stuff like that. And I was quite fascinated. I went to the local bookstore right down the street, and they have a lot of tarot decks there. I was shocked because it's more of a Western tradition, right? And so I was
Hmm.
just looking through. There's like, I don't even know. There's probably like 20 decks over there, and I was looking through. There's like one that was like this anime looking one. It's like that's a pretty
Right.
like Dragon Ball Z characters on it or something like that.
That
I
sounds
thought,
rad.
yeah, I was like, oh, this is kind of funny. It's funny but cool in another way. Yeah, exactly. And just looking at the different decks and how I don't know, they all evoke like a different kind of emotion, right? And so, yeah,
Mm.
I think that would be fun creating a deck. Not only would be like your vision or whatnot, but like what sort of response could you evoke in people with the imagery that you're creating, right? Which would
Right.
be totally unique, maybe to compared to other ones that are out there, right? So.
Yeah, and also the milieu that you're working in, because
Mm-hmm.
like the reason that the Marseille decks looked like that is because that's what the illustrations were like of anything that was illustrated like that back then. And
Mm-hmm.
Pamela Smith was working in that sort of like Art Nouveau thing because that
Mm-hmm.
was what was cool. So I
Right,
think
right.
like working in an anime style or a graphic novel style or something like that kind of makes
Hmm.
sense now.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I mean, everything's like CGI, CG, and Photoshop and
Mm.
everything. So, yeah, even having
Right.
more like a modern take on it would be kind of interesting too. I think definitely.
Yeah.
I haven't really seen any decks that look. I'm sure they're out there. I just haven't really dug around. But any decks that look like super modern or like I don't know, that look more like realistic or something. Like is it
Oh yeah.
like more modernized?
There's
I don't know.
Yeah, there's one, and I don't have it. I've seen like little flip throughs of it and stuff. It's one of those, because you can go totally broke buying tarot decks if they want to go nuts.
Right.
Um, but there's one that what's it called? The True Black Tarot, and it has that kind of like neat. It's got this kind of like modern, kind of neo noir kind of vibe to it. It's pretty cool.
Okay.
That's kind of that's the closest to what it sounds like you were sort of describing, like sort of like more photorealistic in some ways, and
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds pretty interesting. I have to check that out. I was also thinking as you're describing that, like, have you ever used VR, like Oculus Rift or anything like that?
I haven't, no, not personally,
Oh,
no.
okay.
One of my
There. Uh-huh. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, good, okay.
No, I was just thinking it'd be trippy because they're quite realistic. Like you can play
Oh,
it's a trip. Like you can play a skiing game, right? Like you're just standing there. You're not on a slope or anything, obviously, right? But it literally feels like it feels like you're gonna fall off the edge of a cliff or like a jump or
oh
anything,
man.
right? So I was just thinking like, dude, having like a this could be the future too. Having like a virtual tarot reality thing, that would be a trip. That would be, like
That
using,
would be really something, you could
yeah,
actually go
man.
in there and kind of
Hmm.
like that scrying thing that we were talking about, but actually have something programmed on the other end of it or something to talk to, interact with.
Oh man,
Yeah.
that might be something dope to develop. If you know anybody that's in like VR development or something like that, I'm sure like every occultist would be like, I want to try that out. Like,
Right.
hey, yeah, an aid to my scrying or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It'd be pretty interesting, yeah. Okay, you mentioned that you do like you mentioned a little bit about like client readings and whatnot. Do you have like specific products or specific like programs, or like how would people get in touch with you, or what kind of services are you offering in general?
Yeah, right now I basically do readings or consultations. I usually just do like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour, depending on how serious somebody wants to talk about. And I don't have any like courses or anything like that right now.
Mhm.
Although, that might be something coming down the pike. Courses or workshops would be kind of cool. But yeah, so that's generally what I'll do. Right now, because of the situation that we are in, at least in the country I live in,
Mhm.
most of this is happening virtually. So,
Oh,
so
the country you live in? Oh, that shithole? No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, right.
That
But
place is falling apart over there, huh? Looks like the
oh
tower,
yeah,
looking like the tower card right
it
now.
is definitely looking like the tower card in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. But I guess this is a good time in that sense, since you do these readings. Or have you done any? I probably cut you off. You might have been trying to say this, but do you ever do it via like Zoom or Skype? Because that's also a possibility too, right?
Yeah, that's actually mostly what I've been doing in the last
Oh,
year.
nice.
Just
Hmm.
is doing it that way, which is great because it offers me the opportunity to work with people basically anywhere. Like
Hmm.
I've had done readings with people on the other side of the country in different countries.
Right, right. Oh, that's
Ireland.
awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. So, how do people how should people get in touch with you?
Yeah, the best way is at Spear of Fire Tarot
Hmm.
at Instagram.
Hmm.
And you just shoot me a message. You can also email spiritfiretarot at Gmail.
Hmm.
Um, and shoot me a message. Tell me what it is that you're looking for. And yeah, we can set up a time to talk and see what the tarot can do for you. you know.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it sounds cool. Sounds cool. Oh, there's one last question. I just thought about it at the end. Like, say somebody listens to this podcast. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who listen to it, and probably a lot of people that are already into the tarot, or people that might be kind of interested in it, but maybe they listen to this and they got a whole different perspective, and they're like, yeah, I want to dive into this, right?
Mm,
What like say they just want to start learning about it on their own as well, or exploring it. What would you advise them? And then maybe, are there any like pitfalls too, where you'd be like, oh, you might want to avoid this, or um are there any like, yeah, I guess you would say pitfalls or like directions that you would advise them to go into?
sure. Okay, that's a great question. Okay. One of the most helpful things for me because I kind of, like a lot of people, I floundered around, trying to make sense out of the books and stuff that I was reading.
Right. And there are a
Um,
lot of books, right? I
there
think
are
that's one.
so many,
Like
right? Yeah.
the first pitfall that comes in my mind is like, geez, like I remember the first time I like looked up a tarot book. There's like, gee, how many are there? There's like 1,000, and there's a lot of like contradictory information and whatnot, right?
Oh yeah, right. And this is the one true way.
Oh God.
Um, so the best the best thing that I did was a couple of years ago. John Michael Greer, who probably a lot of your listeners will be familiar with, he had a little blog post, and he was like, "Hey, people just keep asking me, how do I learn how to read tarot? So he's like, you can do this with any kind of oracle, but tarot's, the easiest one." So, and this is kind of still basically forms the basis of my like daily practice anyway. And he says, do a little 3-card reading. You take your book out. Well, the first thing was, look at each card and kind of think about it and meditate it. Do it one at a time. Kind of take some time with it. And that's like day 1. And then, go through each card individually and just look at it. Like one day you're going to look at the Fool. The next day you're going to look at the Magician for a couple minutes. The next day you're going to look at the High Priestess and so forth. But then, what you start doing is you do these little 3-card readings, and, every tarot deck comes with this little tiny white book that like explains what the meanings of it are, at least in that tarot deck.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at those meanings and you try to figure out like a little story about what this little 3-card reading, and the format that I use is like, 1 card represents me, 2nd card represents the situation, and the 3rd card represents like the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the meanings, make up this little story about what you saw,
Mm-hmm.
based on the book, whatever the little book says, and write that down. Now you write it down. Now you've written it, so you have a record to see how it actually transpires through your day. And
okay.
you start eventually, because you're encountering the same cards over and over again, you start to kind of know what the things mean before you have to look them up. So that was actually a really helpful practice for me. I think more than anything else, because I had a daily practice. Almost anything, if you want to get good at something, it's not so much that you have to do a whole lot, but you have to do something consistently,
Sure.
And I think having a daily practice of any kind is super helpful. And then as far as like books, there are, you can learn, there are some great books out there. If people want to know more about the Marseille Tarot, probably there's 2 that I could say that are really good. One is the Johan Bendove's book. There's one called, it's basically the same book. There's 2 different versions of it. The Marseille Tarot Revealed, I think, is a newer edition of Tarot, the Open Reading. And that's a really great book about the Marseille Tarot. And then there's another one called Tarot on Earth by Tom Benjamin that is very, very comprehensive. Maybe not as like beginnery, but still you could use it as a beginner. But yeah, so I think that more than anything else, it's having something that you can do that you can be consistent at, is how to kind of like cut through like the contradictory stuff of the different books, because you start to like, so the books say this means that, but every time I see it, this is what it means in my life. So you sort of like, because it's like the way I look at it is tarot is almost kind of like a visual language. So if you're thinking about trying to learn a language, you have to sort of practice with that language or you're never going to learn it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I like that idea of journaling your experimentation and stuff like that too, because you can, like you said, you can keep going back and referring to it and kind of seeing how it manifests in your life. And then you're also by constantly practicing and journaling, you sort of, it becomes a lot easier. Not only are you seeing the patterns, but then also the fact that you're writing it down and everything, it becomes a lot more ingrained, right? Instead of just like doing it and forgetting about it, right? Like you have, not only can you refer to it, but it's like the more you write stuff down and journal it, the more it sort of like seeps in or sinks in or whatnot, right?
Yeah, well, you're using more, you're using your body. It's embodied when you write something down, so it's not just staying around in your head. You actually have to concretize what you said, and you know, it does sink in a very different way.
Yeah, exactly. All right, yeah, cool. Well, that's some really good advice. I think if anybody wants to start, you know, their tarot journey or whatnot. And you mentioned that meditations on the tarot, maybe save that one for later. Is that a little bit too obscure or like
Well, let me.
or something?
No, I'll say this. If you're interested specifically in tarot and you want to learn how to read the tarot,
Mhm.
Meditations on the Tarot is not your book. Okay.
Okay.
Right? If
Okay.
you are interested in, if you are like a more general occultist, if you're interested in spirituality, if you're interested in the relationship between spirituality and religion and science and all that kind of stuff, if you really just want to read the thoughts of a pretty smart guy at the end of his life, then
Mm.
Meditations on Tarot is like I can't recommend it highly enough. But it's not going to make you a tarot reader. But
Gotcha.
that's all. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of confusing because the name does sound like some sort of like when I first heard of the book, I thought it was some sort of like, oh yeah, this is like a sort of like a guided meditation on each card, but that's exactly what it's not, right?
Right. No, it's not that at all. They're these like weird little essays. I mean,
Hmm.
you know, the letter on the devil, which is one of the best things I've ever read, actually, is like starts off as a critique of Marxism. You know,
Wow, that's
you know,
totally unrelated, huh? Wow.
right, right, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'll have
Or
to check
is
that
it?
out.
Or is it? Right.
Right. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Depends on the viewpoint. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Wow. Well, yeah, you made me want to read that book. So hey,
Cool.
you
Cool.
inspired me there. So for sure. I have to check it out for sure. All right. Well, I think it's probably getting late on your end. You're at the end of your day. I got to start my day over here. So
Nice.
guess we can
Yeah,
wrap it up. But yeah, everybody check out Spear of Fire Tarot on Instagram, and I believe the same on Facebook, right? Spear of Fire Tarot.
that's correct. That's correct.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for coming on, and until next time.
All right. Thank you, Ryan.